Thank you very much. Mr. President, I come before the Senate today to speak about a number that has a particular significance for us here. That number is 400. Now, why is 400 an important number at this point in our history? What's important about 400 is that it is the number of parts per million of carbon dioxide that has been measured this spring in the Arctic. It's a first. We've never hit 400 before. For 8,000 centuries, mankind has inhabited this planet within an atmospheric carbon dioxide range of 190 to 300 parts per million. That's been the range. That's the bandwidth that we've lived within. How long is 800,000 years? It's a pretty darn long time. I don't think there are any human remains or artifacts that go back further than 200,000 years. You go back more than 10,000 years, you're only seeing the very beginnings of agriculture, of people beginning to scratch the soil and plant things. So for longer than our species has effectively inhabited this earth, we've been in this happy bandwidth that has supported our lives, has supported a congenial climate for human development, and we are out of it for the first time in that period. 800,000 years. And we're not just a little bit out of it. We didn't go to 302, we didn't go to 350. We've now crossed 400. And we're still going. We are still going. And there is no end in sight. We continue to dump gigatons of carbon dioxide into our atmosphere every single year. We continue to subsidize the people who do the dumping. And at least in this building, and probably in the boardroom of ExxonMobil and a few other places, we studiously ignore the facts that are right before our faces. Right before our faces. Here are just a few stories from the past week or so. A June 4th story in the New York Times reported that climate change threatens power output. Now, why would a warming climate threaten power output? Because warmer waters, when they're pumped through power plants, don't provide the same cooling capacity. So if you're going to keep the plants from overheating, you have to dial back the power output. And for places like the heavily developed U.S. Northeast, we can be pretty close to our margins from time to time, particularly when air conditioning loads are high in the summer. And on those hot days, that increases the risk of power cutbacks or conceivably even power outages. A June 5th story in the U.S. News and World Report described a recently published article in which several European public health experts write that climate change could alter patterns of foodability, change disease distribution, all in ways that could harm human health. If you want an example of how the changing climate changes the way that things move around on this earth, you have to look no farther than the pine beetle, which is decimating our traditional western forests because the winters are no longer cold enough to kill off the larvae. So as the warmth moves ever northward, so do the larvae, and you can fly over mountains and look down and see just brown wasteland of trees that used to be green pine forest. NOAA reported that the lower 48 states just experienced the warmest May on record. The national average temperature for this spring, March through May, was 5.2 degrees above the 1901 to 2000, the 20th century long-term average, surpassing the previous warmest spring ever, 1910, by 2 full degrees. Some states warm faster than others, and Rhode Island, unfortunately for us, is at the top of the list. Climate Central, a research organization, crunched averages of the daily high and low temperatures from the National Climatic Data Center's U.S. Historical Climatology Network of weather stations. Their recently published report determines that over the past 100 years, Rhode Island has actually warmed the fastest of any state. This has terrible consequences for us, from shifting our growing season to harming the cold water fish we catch in our warming Narragansett Bay. Personal aside on this, when my wife was doing her graduate research out in Narragansett Bay, she was studying the interaction between winter flounder and a shrimp that lives in the bay called Crangon septum spinosa. And the reason that that research was important then was because winter flounder was a huge cash crop for our fishermen. It hasn't been that long since she did her graduate research, and winter flounder has fallen off as a cash crop for Rhode Island fishermen because Narragansett Bay has warmed. Its mean winter water temperature is up nearly 4 degrees, which may not seem like us to terrestrial beings when we jump in the water, 61 degrees, 65 degrees. Does that really make a difference to us? No. But to the fish, for whom this is their entire ecosystem, that is an ecosystem shift. And it has completely demolished the winter flounder fishery. It's down something like 10 times. Many people understand that there is a connection between carbon pollution in our atmosphere and these warming temperatures. But it's becoming incontrovertible that these things are happening. The science behind this is rock solid. People say that there are questions about the theory. No. No, there are not. There are questions about some of the complicated modeling that people go through. But the theory has been clear since the time of the American Civil War. The scientist John Tyndall, Tyndall, determined that increasing moisture and increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere had a blanketing effect that kept heat in and trapped heat on our planet. That's been basic textbook science for a century. It's never been controverted. It's a law, essentially, of science. And yet, there are special interests here who try to deny that. Set against those special interests is about as unanimous a coalition from science as has ever been assembled. Virtually every prestigious scientific and academic institution has stated that climate change is happening and that human activities, specifically our reckless release of carbon pollution, are the driving cause of this change. In 2009, there was a very, very clear letter signed by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the Chemical Society, the Geophysical Union, the Institute of Biological Sciences, the Societies of Agronomy and Plant Biologists, the Statistical Association, the Botanical Society, the Crop Science and Ecological Societies, the National Science Collections Alliance, and on and on. And here's what they said, in words that, for scientists, are pretty darned hard-hitting. Observations throughout the world make it clear, clear is the word they used, that climate change is occurring, and rigorous scientific research demonstrates that the greenhouse gases emitted by human activities are the primary driver. Not observations throughout the world make it likely that climate change is occurring, not rigorous scientific research potentially indicates, not that greenhouse gases emitted by human activities might be the primary driver, but that it is clear, that it is demonstrated, and that they are the primary driver. They go on, these conclusions are based on multiple independent lines of evidence. And here's what you might call the sockdologer. Contrary assertions are inconsistent with an objective assessment of the vast body of peer-reviewed science. In a nutshell, if you're looking at the actual peer-reviewed science, and if you're being objective, if you're not putting your thumb on the scales, contrary assertions are inconsistent with that. You're basically making it up. So that's a pretty powerful statement. The argument that the jury is still out on climate change is a false and bogus argument. The jury is not out. In fact, the verdict is in. The effects are obvious. They surround us every day, and we need to take action. I've been here on the floor with Senator Franken before, and we've talked about this, and he makes a wonderful point, which is that 97% of the climate scientists agree that this is happening. It's happening because of our carbon pollution, and we need to do something urgent about it. 3% question it. 97-3 is the odds. And we're asked to avoid taking any action, don't worry about it, because there's doubt, because there's debate. Well, translate that to your real, ordinary human life, not this peculiar political world that we're in down here, but in your ordinary human life. Let's say you have a child, and the child appears to be sick. And you go in to see the doctor, and the doctor says, yep, your child is sick, and she's going to need treatment. And you say, ooh, yeah, the treatment's kind of expensive. It might be a little bit unpleasant. There might be side effects. Tell you what, I'm going to get a second opinion. So you go to another doctor. And the other doctor says the exact same thing. Your child is sick, going to need treatment. And you say, well, 2 opinions. That's kind of a lot, but let's just be sure here. Let's get a 3rd opinion. And that doctor said the same thing too. What would you think of the parent who did that 100 times? Who was told by 97 out of 100 doctors that their child was sick and needed treatment, and then said, you know what? There's doubt about this. I'm not sure. I'm not going to give my child the treatment that they need. It's a preposterous example, isn't it? It is an absolutely ridiculous point of view for the parent to hold. Yet that is exactly the point of view that we are being asked to hold as we deny and delay the steps that we have to take to protect ourselves, to protect our children, to protect our country from the damage that is being done, frankly, by ourselves, by the polluting interests that we don't take adequate steps to put on the right track towards a successful and clean energy future. The last thing I'll say is on that exact point. The more we depend on fossil fuels, the more we depend on a diminishing resource that pollutes our country, that as it diminishes, forces prices up under the laws of supply and demand, and that in practice and right now forces us to engage with foreign oil-producing countries that do not have our best interests at heart, and we send our dollars, hundreds of millions of them, into their treasuries so that that money can filter out into organizations that actually wish to do us harm. That's not a great state of affairs. The alternative is a clean energy future where American homes are more efficient. We've replaced windows, we've added insulation, we've improved boilers, we've created innumerable jobs through all that work, and we've paid for it with reduced energy costs. It pays for itself, sometimes in a year, sometimes in 2 years, sometimes in 5 years, but it pays for itself, and it creates work. We're in a battle right now for clean energy technologies. It is an international competition. It is us against China, us against India, us against the European Union. Every single one of the other countries gets it, and they are trying to push resources onto their clean energy industries so that they can lap us in this race. They can get so far ahead of us that we become the world's biggest global consumer of clean energy, not its biggest manufacturer. We invented the solar cell. 15 years ago, we made 40% of all the solar cells in the world. We're down to, I think, 7% now. The top 10 wind turbine countries in the world include one American company, one. And by knocking down the production tax credits, by eliminating the 1603 program, by subsidizing like crazy big oil, people in this building are doing their very best not to help us in the race against foreign competition, but to put weights in the pockets of American companies, to tie their shoelaces together, to interfere with our ability to compete. They don't see it yet as international competition. They're so tied to the fossil fuel industry, they only see it as competition between fossil fuels and clean energy, and in that battle, they want to be with the fossil fuel industry. They don't see the future. They don't see how important these technologies are going to be in batteries, in wind, in clean energy, in all of these areas where we not only can command our energy future by building and creating the power that we use and unhinge ourselves from these foreign dictatorships that run off oil economies, but we can improve the future and the safety of our planet by dialing down the pollution. My state pays a particular price. We are downwind of the Midwestern polluters, the big utility companies, the big manufacturing companies, the ones that have built 1,000-foot-high smokestacks for the specific purpose of shoving as much of their pollution as high in the atmosphere as they can so that it doesn't rain down on their states, not on Missouri, not on Ohio, not on Pennsylvania, that it rains down on Rhode Island, on Massachusetts, on Vermont, on other states. I was here earlier this morning talking about the Mercury rule. We have ponds and lakes and reservoirs in Rhode Island where it is unsafe to eat the fish that you catch because of mercury poisoning. It's unsafe everywhere in Rhode Island to eat the fish that you catch if you're a child or an expectant mother. But in these ponds, nobody can safely eat the fish that you catch because there's so much mercury in them. How did the mercury get there? How did the mercury get there? From pollution. Out of the smokestacks, dumped down on our state. There is nothing that we can do to prevent it other than to support EPA in these mercury limit rules. So there's a real cost to continuing down this fossil fuel path. My home state pays it all the time. And when it comes time to reap the whirlwind of storm activity, of sea level rise, coastal states like Rhode Island will pay a particularly high price. So I'm going to continue to come to the Senate floor. This is not a popular topic. The presiding officer, Senator Sanders of Vermont, is eloquent, articulate, and a constant ally on these subjects. There are probably, there's a handful of us who are regular on this subject, but I think for a great many of my colleagues, and particularly for virtually everybody on the other side of the aisle, they just as soon wash their hands of it, forget about it, pretend it's not happening, and continue to sleepwalk towards disaster. So I'm going to keep doing this. It's important to my state. I think it's important to our country, and I appreciate the attention of the presiding officer and those who have the attention of the floor.